The cruelest mistakes are never made in anger. They are made in certainty. On a gray Manhattan morning, beneath a sky that looked as if it had forgotten how to let the sun through, Ethan Romano sat at the polished walnut conference table and watched the woman he had once promised forever slide a fountain pen across the final page. Naomi Carter never trembled. She never begged. She never tried to change his mind. The silence around her was so complete that even the soft ticking of the antique clock mounted above the fireplace sounded louder than it should have. The divorce attorney adjusted his glasses, gathered the signed documents, and cleared his throat with practiced professionalism. But even he seemed reluctant to disturb the strange calm filling the room. Ethan had expected tears. He had expected accusations, questions, perhaps one last desperate attempt to remind him of the years they had built together. Instead, Naomi simply folded her hands in her lap and looked through the tall windows where rain slid slowly down the glass. She wore no expensive jewelry, no designer handbag, nothing that reflected the wealth surrounding the Romano family. The simple navy dress she had chosen made her appear almost invisible against the elegant room, yet somehow she remained the only person Ethan could truly see. He told himself that was because this was the end, because endings always demanded attention, because walking away from a marriage should feel significant, even when it was the right decision. At least that was what he had convinced himself for months. Rumors had reached him from every direction. Trusted advisors questioned Naomi's long absences. Business associates whispered that she carried secrets she refused to share. Family members insisted she no longer belonged beside a man responsible for an empire built on discipline, loyalty, and absolute transparency. Ethan had listened. He had measured every conversation, every unexplained phone call, every quiet smile she offered instead of an answer. Eventually, certainty replaced curiosity. And certainty, he believed, was safer than doubt. The attorney slid the final document toward him. Ethan signed without hesitation. His signature flowed across the paper in bold black ink, decisive and clean, as though ending 7 years together required no more emotion than approving another business contract. When the attorney carefully organized the paperwork into a leather folder, he finally looked up. "Mrs. Romano," he said softly, "everything has been finalized." Naomi nodded once. No celebration, no heartbreak, just acceptance. She rose slowly, smoothing the fabric of her dress with calm hands. Ethan waited for something to happen, for some hidden emotion to break through the composure she wore like quiet armor. Nothing came. She walked toward the door with measured steps before pausing with her hand resting lightly against the brass handle. Without turning around, she spoke in a voice so gentle it almost disappeared into the room. "One day," she said, "you'll wish you had asked me one more question." The words lingered in the air long after she opened the door. Ethan almost answered. Almost. But pride had a way of disguising itself as confidence. He leaned back in his chair instead, convincing himself she was speaking from pain rather than truth. The door closed with barely a sound. She was gone. The attorney remained motionless, staring at the folder in front of him before slowly removing his glasses. "Mr. Romano," he said after an uncomfortable silence, "I've handled thousands of divorces." Ethan reached for the crystal glass of water beside him without looking away from the closed door. "Congratulations," he replied coolly. "Then today wasn't unusual." The attorney hesitated. "Actually," he answered quietly, "I've never seen someone leave behind so much without asking for anything." Ethan frowned. Naomi had requested no financial settlement, no property, no investments, no ownership in the penthouse overlooking Central Park. She had voluntarily signed away everything the law would have allowed her to keep. He dismissed it as pride. Another performance. Another attempt to appear noble. Yet something about the attorney's expression refused to leave him. "Sir," the older man continued carefully, "are you absolutely certain there isn't something you should ask her before? These papers are filed." Ethan looked toward the rain-streaked windows again. Somewhere below, the city continued moving as though nothing important had happened. Yellow taxis disappeared beneath shimmering streets. People hurried beneath umbrellas. Life continued exactly as it always had. He exhaled slowly and stood. "No," he answered with unwavering confidence. "If she had something worth telling me, she would have told me already." He picked up his tailored overcoat. unaware that the greatest mistake of his life had not been signing the divorce papers. It had been believing silence meant there was nothing left to hear. The rain had not stopped by the time Naomi Carter stepped out of the Romano building, carrying a single medium-sized suitcase and a canvas tote that looked older than her marriage. The security guards standing beneath the marble entrance instinctively moved toward her, offering to call a driver, but she greeted each of them with the same warm smile they had known for years and quietly declined. She thanked them by name, wished one of them luck for his daughter's college interview the following week, and reminded another not to forget the medication his wife needed every Thursday afternoon. They exchanged puzzled glances after she disappeared into the crowd, because no one leaving a life of unimaginable wealth should have looked so peaceful. From the 38th floor, Ethan Romano watched the black sedan he assumed she would request never arrive. Instead, she walked 3 city blocks through the steady rain before disappearing into the subway station with ordinary commuters who had no idea the woman beside them had just walked away from one of the wealthiest families in New York. He turned away from the window before she vanished from sight. It was better this way, he told himself. Cleaner, simpler, necessary. By noon, the penthouse already felt different. Housekeepers quietly removed framed photographs from the hallway. Her favorite books disappeared from the living room shelves. The vase of fresh white lilies she had replaced every Monday morning was gone from the dining table. The rooms looked exactly as they had before she entered his life, yet something invisible had been carefully taken away with every missing detail. Ethan ignored it. He buried himself in financial reports, conference calls, and meetings that stretched late into the afternoon. Numbers always behaved logically. Businesses made sense. Feelings rarely did. Just after 5 o'clock, his chief of staff entered the office carrying a thick folder. "Sir," Daniel Brooks said cautiously, "these are the property transfer documents Mrs. Romano refused to sign because she said she did not need them." Ethan barely looked up. "Then file everything under my name." Daniel remained standing. "There is more." Ethan sighed impatiently. "What now?" Daniel slowly opened the folder. She also declined the settlement account, the vacation homes, the investment portfolio, the vehicles, and the monthly support payments. Ethan finally lifted his eyes from the report on his desk. "She is making a point." Daniel hesitated. "Perhaps." Ethan leaned back in his chair with a faint smile that never reached his eyes. "She wants people to think she is noble. Eventually she will call." Daniel nodded politely, but something about his silence felt unusually heavy. After nearly 12 years working beside Ethan, he had learned when not to argue. Still, before leaving the office, he quietly placed one final envelope on the desk. She asked the receptionist to leave this for accounting. Ethan waited until the door closed before opening it. Inside was a simple inventory written entirely in Naomi's careful handwriting. Every family heirloom she had received during the marriage had been returned. Every expensive watch, necklace, bracelet, and piece of artwork was listed with remarkable precision. Even the engagement ring rested inside a small velvet pouch attached to the final page. At the bottom she had written only one sentence. "Nothing here ever truly belonged to me." Ethan stared at the words for several seconds before folding the paper shut. He refused to let guilt disguise itself as sympathy. She had chosen this path. She had accepted the divorce without resistance. Whatever quiet game she was playing would eventually end. Across the city, Naomi unlocked the door to a modest apartment overlooking an elevated train line where every passing train gently rattled the windows. The building was old but clean, the kind of place where neighbors greeted each other in the hallway and children left bicycles near the entrance without worrying they would disappear overnight. She placed her suitcase beside the couch and slowly walked through the empty rooms as though greeting an old friend. There was no luxury, no marble floors, no breathtaking skyline. Only warm afternoon light filtering through faded curtains and the comforting sound of ordinary life outside. She opened her tote bag and carefully removed a worn leather journal, placing it inside the top drawer of a small wooden dresser before locking it with a tiny brass key she wore around her neck. Her hand rested on the drawer for a long moment. Tears gathered in her eyes, but never fell. "Not yet," she whispered to herself. "He still believes the easiest story." Miles away, Ethan poured himself a glass of sparkling water and looked once more toward the empty side of the bedroom where Naomi had always left a novel on the nightstand before going to sleep. The table stood completely bare now. For reasons he could not explain, the silence felt louder than it had the day before, and somewhere deep beneath the certainty he had trusted for so long, the first quiet crack had begun to form. 3 days passed, and Ethan Romano discovered that silence could be louder than any argument. Naomi never called. She did not send messages through attorneys, mutual friends, or members of the household staff who had once admired her quiet kindness. She simply disappeared into a life that seemed to exist beyond the reach of the Romano name. That alone unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Every morning began with the same disciplined routine that had governed his life for years. Before sunrise, he reviewed financial reports while the city slowly awakened beneath the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse. Yet something small interrupted the rhythm each day. The coffee waiting beside his desk never tasted quite right. The white lilies that had always brightened the dining room no longer appeared every Monday. Even the grand piano in the corner seemed strangely neglected, its polished surface gathering a thin layer of dust because no one remembered to uncover it at sunset the way Naomi always had. Ethan dismissed each observation as habit rather than loss. Habits could be replaced. People could not always be trusted. Late that Friday afternoon, Daniel Brooks entered carrying a narrow storage box recovered from the private archives beneath the penthouse library. Maintenance found this while reorganizing the lower cabinets, Daniel explained. They assumed it belonged to Mrs. Romano, but there is no forwarding address. Ethan barely glanced toward the box. Then donate whatever is inside. Daniel hesitated. Sir, your name is written across the lid. After the door closed, Ethan slowly pulled the box closer. It was surprisingly light. Inside lay neatly organized folders tied with pale blue ribbon, a small photo album, and a wooden music box carved with delicate cherry blossoms. Everything smelled faintly of cedar and lavender. The first folder contained receipts from nearly 7 years of marriage. Grocery bills, pharmacy purchases, children's charity donations, hospital parking receipts. Nothing unusual. The second folder held birthday cards Naomi had written but never given him because, according to the notes folded inside, he had always been traveling on business. Each message ended with hope rather than disappointment. Maybe next year we will celebrate together. I know you are doing important work. Please remember to eat before midnight. Ethan closed the folder more quickly than he intended. None of it proved anything except that she had been sentimental. He reached for the photo album instead. The first pages contained ordinary memories. Their wedding beneath autumn trees in Connecticut. A summer afternoon sailing off Long Island. Christmas mornings surrounded by staff members Naomi insisted should celebrate like family instead of employees. Ethan noticed something peculiar only after several pages. In nearly every photograph, Naomi stood slightly behind him rather than beside him. At the time, he had assumed it reflected her modest personality. Looking now, it almost appeared intentional, as though she had always preferred remaining outside the spotlight while quietly supporting everyone else inside it. He turned another page and paused. Tucked between two photographs rested a pressed white camellia flower. It had long since dried into fragile ivory petals. A tiny handwritten note accompanied it. The first flower you ever gave me. You said it reminded you that strength could still be gentle. Ethan frowned. He remembered buying flowers that day after an important meeting, but he had completely forgotten saying those words. Naomi had remembered every syllable. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Come in, he called. Daniel stepped inside once more. Sir, there is one more matter. Ethan closed the album. What is it? A hospital called this morning asking for Mrs. Romano. They apologized after realizing she no longer lives here. Ethan remained expressionless. People change addresses every day. Daniel nodded. Yes, sir. They did not explain why they were looking for her. They only asked whether anyone could reach her urgently. Ethan felt a brief tightening in his chest before logic quickly silenced it. There were countless harmless reasons a hospital might call. Routine paperwork, insurance records, administrative errors. He refused to imagine anything else. If they call again, tell them to contact her attorney, he said calmly. Of course, sir. After Daniel left, Ethan looked once more at the wooden music box resting inside the storage box. Almost absent-mindedly, he lifted the lid. A gentle melody drifted into the quiet room, delicate enough to make the enormous penthouse feel unexpectedly small. Hidden beneath the velvet lining, something caught the afternoon light. It was not jewelry or money. It was a tiny brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon identical to the ones tying the folders together. Ethan picked it up slowly, turning it between his fingers. There was no label, no explanation, only a single engraved letter on the handle. The letter N. For the first time since signing the divorce papers, certainty no longer felt as solid as stone. It felt like thin ice beginning to crack beneath perfectly polished shoes. The brass key remained in Ethan Romano's coat pocket throughout the weekend, although he never admitted to himself why he kept carrying it. It was a small object, almost weightless, yet every time his hand brushed against it, he remembered the calm expression on Naomi's face as she walked out of his life without asking for anything in return. By Monday morning, the city had returned to its familiar rhythm. Markets opened, office towers filled with hurried professionals. The Romano headquarters buzzed with executives preparing for another week of negotiations, but Ethan found it unusually difficult to focus. During an investment presentation, he caught himself staring through the conference room windows instead of studying the charts projected across the screen. Daniel Brooks noticed immediately, but wisely chose not to mention it. Shortly after noon, the receptionist called his private office. "Sir, St. Catherine Medical Center is on the line again. They are asking whether we have updated contact information for Mrs. Romano." Ethan remained silent for a brief moment before answering. "Transfer the call." A calm female voice introduced herself as an administrative coordinator. She apologized for the inconvenience and explained that they had been attempting to reach Naomi regarding several pending documents. Ethan expected details, but none came. Medical privacy regulations prevented further discussion. "Is it urgent?" he asked. Another pause followed. "I am only authorized to say that we hope to speak with her as soon as possible, sir." The call ended politely, yet it left behind more questions than answers. Ethan stared at the silent receiver before setting it down. A simple paperwork issue should not have required multiple attempts over several days. He immediately dismissed the thought, reminding himself that hospitals handled thousands of administrative matters every week. Still, uncertainty had begun replacing the confidence that had once guided every decision. That evening, after most employees had gone home, Ethan unlocked the storage box again. The tiny brass key rested beside the music box exactly where he had left it. This time he examined every corner more carefully. Beneath a false cardboard insert, his fingers touched another envelope that had escaped his attention before. It contained several folded receipts and a small handwritten calendar. The receipts were ordinary at first glance. Parking fees, coffee purchases, pharmacy visits. But every hospital receipt shared one unusual detail. Naomi had always arrived alone. No accompanying visitor had signed in with her. No emergency contact had been listed. Ethan searched his memory. She had never mentioned frequent appointments. Whenever he asked about her day, she always smiled gently and redirected the conversation toward his own responsibilities. He had accepted those answers without another question because business demands constantly competed for his attention. Now that silence no longer felt harmless. Across the city, Naomi sat beside the window of her modest apartment as the evening commuter trains rolled past with their familiar metallic rhythm. A cup of untouched tea rested on the table beside a neatly folded stack of unopened letters. One envelope carried the logo of St. Catherine Medical Center. Another displayed the name of a law office she had never contacted. She quietly placed both inside the locked drawer containing her leather journal. "Just a little longer," she whispered to herself, closing the drawer with deliberate care. She was not hiding from Ethan out of anger. She was protecting something that could not yet be revealed. The following morning, Ethan attended a charity breakfast his foundation sponsored every year. He had rarely paid attention to the event beyond making the necessary donation, but Naomi had always insisted on meeting the volunteers personally. As he prepared to leave, an elderly volunteer recognized him and smiled warmly. "Mrs. Romano could not come this year," she asked. Ethan politely explained that they had separated. The woman's smile slowly faded into quiet surprise. "I am so sorry to hear that," she said. She never missed a single visit. Every month, without fail, she spent Saturday mornings reading to children in the recovery wing. She always arrived before anyone else and left after every child had fallen asleep. Ethan blinked. "Recovery wing?" "Yes, The volunteer answered gently. She always said that lonely people heal better when someone simply stays with them. Before Ethan could ask another question, another guest called the volunteer away. He remained standing in the crowded ballroom, surrounded by conversations and laughter that suddenly sounded distant. He realized there were entire chapters of Naomi's life he had never bothered to read because he had assumed he already knew the ending. As he drove back through the city, his phone vibrated with a message from Daniel. It contained only one sentence. "Sir, someone from Mrs. Romano's past has arrived asking to speak with you, and he says there is something you were never supposed to discover." The visitor was already waiting when Ethan Romano arrived at his private office overlooking the Manhattan skyline. He was an older man dressed in a neatly pressed brown suit that had clearly been tailored years earlier but maintained with remarkable care. His silver hair was combed back, and a weathered leather briefcase rested quietly beside his chair. There was nothing intimidating about him, yet the confidence in his posture suggested he had not come to ask for favors. Daniel Brooks stood near the doorway. "Sir, this is Reverend Samuel Bennett." He said Mrs. Romano volunteered at his community center for several years. Ethan nodded politely before dismissing Daniel. The office became unusually quiet as the older man slowly rose to his feet. "Thank you for seeing me," Reverend Bennett said warmly. "Naomi would probably prefer that I stayed away, but I believe there comes a moment when silence becomes unfair." Ethan remained standing. "You said there was something I was never supposed to discover." The Reverend smiled gently. "Not because she wanted to deceive you, because she never wanted you to carry the burden of knowing." He carefully opened the leather briefcase and removed several photographs, placing them across the polished desk. Ethan expected images of family gatherings or charity events. Instead, he found photographs of Naomi sitting beside elderly residents, inside a nursing home, reading books to children recovering from serious illnesses, organizing food boxes at community kitchens, and quietly repairing the roof of a neighborhood center alongside local volunteers. In every picture, she wore ordinary clothes, no jewelry, and the same peaceful smile he had almost forgotten. "She never mentioned any of this," Ethan said softly. "She promised she never would," Reverend Bennett replied. "She believed kindness stopped being kindness the moment it became a performance." Ethan picked up one photograph showing Naomi sitting on the floor beside a young boy assembling a toy airplane. The date printed in the corner caught his attention. It had been taken on the same Saturday Ethan clearly remembered accusing her of avoiding an important family gathering. She had accepted the criticism without defending herself. He had never asked where she had actually been. The Reverend reached into his briefcase again and removed a thin notebook filled with handwritten names. "These are scholarship records," he explained. "Every year she paid for students who could not afford college application fees. She always requested complete anonymity." Ethan slowly turned the pages. There were dozens of names. Some students had already graduated. Others had become teachers, nurses, engineers, and social workers. Every payment had been made from Naomi's personal savings rather than Romano family accounts. "She told us something once," Reverend Bennett continued quietly. "She said wealth is measured by how many people feel less alone after meeting you." Ethan lowered his eyes. Those words sounded exactly like Naomi, yet he had never heard them before. He suddenly realized how little he had truly known about the woman who had shared his home for 7 years. "Why are you telling me this now?" he finally asked. The Reverend became unusually serious. "Because she asked everyone who loved her to keep these things hidden until she no longer needed protecting." Ethan frowned. Protecting from what? The older man hesitated before carefully choosing his words. From being loved for what she gave instead of who she was. The answer left Ethan strangely unsettled. It sounded incomplete, as though another truth remained hidden beneath it. Reverend Bennett closed the notebook and stood. Before leaving, he placed one final envelope on the desk. "She asked me to destroy this if circumstances never changed," he said quietly. "I could not." Ethan waited until the office door closed before opening it. Inside was a folded sheet of paper written entirely in Naomi's familiar handwriting. It was not a letter addressed to him. It was a personal checklist. Several items had already been marked complete. Renew college scholarships. Visit St. Catherine Medical Center every Saturday. Deliver winter coats before Thanksgiving. Confirm donation for Children's Recovery Program. The final line remained unchecked. It simply read, "Tell Ethan the truth when the time is right." There was no explanation of what that truth might be. Only those 8 carefully written words. Ethan stared at the page until the evening sunlight faded behind the buildings outside his window. For the first time since the divorce, he no longer wondered whether Naomi had been hiding something from him. He knew she had. The question that now refused to leave his mind was infinitely more painful. If she had trusted the entire world with her compassion, why had she believed she could not trust her own husband with the truth? The sentence at the bottom of Naomi's handwritten checklist refused to leave Ethan Romano's thoughts. He read it again before sunrise, then folded the paper with unusual care and slipped it inside the inner pocket of his coat. For years he had believed every important truth could be uncovered through patience, logic, and careful observation. Now he was beginning to understand that the most important truth in his own life had remained invisible because he had stopped asking questions long before Naomi stopped answering them. By mid-morning, he instructed Daniel Brooks to clear his schedule. It was the first time in years he had canceled meetings without replacing them with new appointments. "I need the complete timeline of every charity event Naomi attended during the last 7 years," Ethan said quietly. Daniel looked surprised but nodded. Without hesitation. "And there is something else," Ethan continued. "Do not send investigators. Do not ask my security team to follow her. I want facts, not surveillance." Daniel understood immediately that something had changed. This was no longer about proving Naomi wrong. It was about discovering who she had truly been. That afternoon, Ethan drove himself to St. Catherine Medical Center instead of using his usual driver. The hospital lobby was bright with afternoon sunlight reflecting across polished floors, while volunteers pushed book carts between waiting families and nurses greeted patients with reassuring smiles. It was a place built around quiet hope rather than urgency. Ethan approached the reception desk and introduced himself. The administrator recognized Naomi's name immediately, but her warm expression became apologetic. "I am sorry, sir," she said gently. "Federal privacy laws prevent us from discussing another person's medical information." Ethan nodded. "I understand. I am not asking for confidential records. I only need to know why everyone here seems to know my former wife." The administrator studied him for a moment before answering. "Because she knew almost everyone here." She smiled softly as though remembering an old friend. "She came every Saturday for nearly 6 years. She read to children, organized family dinners during holidays, helped elderly patients complete insurance forms, and stayed long after her volunteer hours ended. Whenever someone asked why she spent so much time here, she always said the same thing. She said that healing begins the moment someone feels remembered." Ethan remained speechless. He remembered every Saturday business dinner he had attended during those same years. Every time Naomi politely declined because she claimed she had already made plans. He had assumed she simply preferred avoiding his business circle. He had never imagined this. As he prepared to leave, a pediatric nurse hurried across the lobby after recognizing him from photographs she had once seen on Naomi's phone. "Excuse me, Mr. Romano," she called. "May I give you something?" From a nearby cabinet, she retrieved a handmade thank you card, decorated with bright watercolor flowers. Inside, dozens of children had written short messages thanking Naomi for stories she had read, birthdays she had celebrated, and afternoons she had spent simply listening. One sentence near the center caught Ethan's attention. Written in careful block letters, it read, "Miss Naomi says every person deserves someone who waits with them." His fingers tightened slightly around the card. No expensive gift he had ever received carried as much meaning as those simple words. As he stepped outside, his phone rang. Daniel's voice sounded unusually restrained. "Sir, I finished reviewing the timeline you requested." Ethan leaned against the stone railing outside the hospital entrance. "What did you find?" There was a long pause before Daniel answered. Every hospital visit matched the same dates. Mrs. Romano disappeared for several hours without explanation. But there is another pattern. Ethan waited. "On every one of those days," Daniel continued carefully, "you were attending medical follow-up appointments after your heart surgery 7 years ago." Ethan closed his eyes. He remembered that difficult season clearly. He remembered waking after surgery, exhausted but hopeful. He remembered Naomi sitting beside his bed every evening with calm eyes and reassuring words. What he did not remember was leaving her side long enough to ask where she disappeared every afternoon. He had assumed she was resting or shopping or handling ordinary errands. Daniel spoke again, his voice almost hesitant. "There is one more thing, sir. According to the hospital records we could legally verify, Mrs. Romano was never here as a patient. She came because someone else inside the hospital mattered more to her than anyone realized." Ethan slowly lowered the phone. The answer he had searched for was finally beginning to appear, but instead of bringing relief, it opened an even deeper mystery. If Naomi had devoted years of her life to someone hidden inside those hospital walls, why had she believed that telling her own husband the truth would cost her everything? The answer did not arrive as a dramatic confession or a hidden document buried inside a forgotten drawer. It arrived quietly, the way the most life-changing truths often do. Ethan Romano returned to St. Catherine Medical Center the following afternoon, carrying nothing except the handmade card the children had given him and the growing weight of questions that no business strategy could solve. He found the same administrator arranging flowers near the volunteer desk. She recognized him immediately and offered a sympathetic smile. "You came back," she said gently. Ethan nodded. "I need to understand why Naomi devoted so many years to this place." The administrator remained silent for a long moment before looking toward a framed photograph hanging on the opposite wall. It showed dozens of volunteers gathered around children during a holiday celebration. Naomi stood near the back, smiling exactly as she always had in every photograph Ethan had recently discovered, content to let everyone else stand in front. "There is one thing I can tell you without violating anyone's privacy," the administrator finally said. "Mrs. Romano spent years mentoring a young girl whose family had no one else. She believed every child deserved to feel chosen." Ethan followed her gaze toward the photograph until he noticed a little girl standing beside Naomi with tightly braided hair and an enormous smile. The child held Naomi's hand with complete trust. "Who is she?" he asked. The administrator shook her head apologetically. "I cannot tell you her name, but I can tell you that Mrs. Romano never missed a birthday, never missed a school recital, and never forgot a promise." Ethan felt something inside him quietly collapse. During those same years, he had often complained that Naomi spent too much time away from home. He had measured her absences without ever measuring the reasons behind them. As he thanked the administrator and turned to leave, an elderly volunteer approached carrying a small cardboard box. "Mr. Romano?" she asked softly. "Mrs. Romano left this here several months ago. She told us that if you ever came looking for answers instead of arguments, we should give it to you." Ethan accepted the box with careful hands. Inside rested a children's storybook, a faded friendship bracelet woven from blue and gold thread, and a sealed envelope with his name written across the front in Naomi's unmistakable handwriting. His heartbeat slowed as he opened it. The letter contained only a few lines. "If you are reading this, it means you finally chose curiosity over certainty. Thank you for coming this far. There is still something I cannot tell you myself because it was never only my secret to share. When the time is right, someone else will help you understand why I had to stay silent. Until then, please promise me one thing. Do not let regret become heavier than compassion." Ethan read the letter twice before carefully folding it again. There was still no explanation, only another doorway leading toward a truth he had not yet reached. That evening, Daniel Brooks entered the penthouse carrying another report. "Sir, I located the apartment Mrs. Romano rented after the divorce." Ethan immediately looked up. "Is she there?" Daniel slowly shook his head. "The landlord said she left yesterday morning with only one overnight bag. She told him she might be gone for several days." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Every hour seemed to place more distance between them. Yet this time he refused to let pride convince him to stop searching. "Did she leave anything behind?" he asked. Daniel hesitated before placing a small envelope on the table. "Only this. The landlord said she asked him to give it to the first person who came looking for her with kindness instead of authority." Ethan carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Naomi sitting beside the same young girl from the hospital, both of them laughing beneath a maple tree whose leaves glowed bright orange in the autumn sunlight. Written across the back in neat handwriting were 8 simple words that stole every remaining trace of certainty from his heart. "Family is not always the one you expect to find." Ethan stared at the sentence as evening settled over the city outside his windows. For the first time, he realized that whatever secret Naomi had protected all these years was never about preserving herself. It had always been about protecting someone else. and he could no longer escape the feeling that every step he took toward the truth would reveal not only who Naomi really was, but also the man he had failed to become. 2 mornings later, Ethan Romano stood outside a modest brick building in Brooklyn with the photograph still folded inside his coat pocket. The address had come from Reverend Samuel Bennett, who had quietly admitted that Naomi occasionally volunteered at a neighborhood learning center whenever she wanted to disappear from the expectations attached to the Romano name. There were no luxury vehicles parked along the street, no marble entrance, no private security. Children laughed in a nearby playground while parents carried grocery bags home beneath the warm afternoon sun. The ordinary beauty of the neighborhood felt strangely unfamiliar to a man whose entire life had unfolded behind guarded gates and polished glass. Through the large front windows of the learning center, Ethan finally saw her. Naomi sat beside the same little girl from the photograph, helping her finish a watercolor painting of a bright blue sky stretching above a field of yellow flowers. She looked exactly as she always had, calm, patient, completely present. The little girl smiled proudly before running toward another classroom, leaving Naomi alone at the table. Ethan hesitated for several seconds before quietly stepping inside. The wooden floor creaked beneath his shoes. Naomi looked up. Surprise crossed her face for only a heartbeat before settling back into the familiar serenity he had spent weeks trying to understand. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence between them no longer felt empty. It carried every unanswered question, every forgotten memory, and every opportunity that had quietly slipped away. Ethan slowly reached into his coat and placed the photograph on the table between them. Naomi looked down at it and gently traced the edge with one fingertip. "You found it," she said softly. "I found pieces," Ethan answered. "Not the whole truth." Naomi folded her hands together. "Sometimes the whole truth belongs to more than one person." Ethan nodded. For the first time since the day of the divorce, he did not interrupt her or demand explanations. He simply listened. "I have been learning who you really are," he admitted. "Not from you. From everyone whose life you quietly touched." Naomi smiled sadly. "Then they broke their promises." "No," Ethan replied. "They protected you until they believed I was finally ready to hear them." Her eyes met his. There was no anger inside them, only a quiet exhaustion that came from carrying a burden for far too long. Ethan lowered his voice. "Why did you never tell me?" Naomi looked toward the classroom, where the little girl was now laughing with other children. "Because some stories are not mine to give away," she answered. "I promised someone that their life would never become proof that I was a good person. Keeping that promise mattered more than receiving credit." Ethan felt every carefully built assumption inside him crumble. He remembered accusing her of secrecy, of distance, of choosing strangers over their marriage. He had mistaken humility for deception because he had expected love to announce itself instead of living quietly through ordinary acts of kindness. "I judged you without asking," he whispered. Naomi looked back at him with remarkable gentleness. Yes. There was no accusation in the single word. Somehow that made it infinitely heavier. Ethan drew a slow breath. "I cannot change what I did." "No," Naomi agreed. "None of us can change yesterday." Another silence settled between them as sunlight poured through the windows, warming the wooden table where the photograph still rested. Finally, Ethan spoke again. "I came here because I wanted forgiveness." Naomi considered his words before answering. "Forgiveness is not the hardest part, Ethan." He looked at her with quiet confusion. "Believing that someone has truly changed," she continued, "always takes longer." Before he could respond, the little girl ran back into the room carrying a drawing. "Miss Naomi," she said happily, "I finished it." Naomi accepted the picture with genuine delight. It showed 3 people standing beneath an enormous tree, holding hands while birds flew across a bright blue sky. "Who are they?" Naomi asked with a smile. The little girl pointed to each figure one by one. "That is me. That is you. And that is the man you said was still learning how to listen." Ethan felt his throat tighten. Naomi had never taught the child to resent him. Even after everything that had happened, she had chosen hope over bitterness. As the little girl skipped away again, Naomi carefully folded the drawing and looked back at Ethan. "The person whose secret I protected is finally ready to meet you," she said quietly. "When you hear the whole story, your life will never look the same again." The following afternoon, Naomi Carter led Ethan Romano through the quiet halls of the neighborhood learning center until they reached a small reading room filled with shelves of colorful books, handmade artwork, and sunlight pouring through wide windows. Sitting near the corner was the little girl from the photograph, carefully finishing a homework assignment while an elderly woman watched over her with a gentle smile. Naomi paused before speaking. "Her name is Grace," she said softly. "Several years ago, she lost the only family she had. Before I met her, she believed she had been forgotten by the world." Grace looked up and smiled warmly at Naomi before waving at Ethan with the innocent confidence only children possess. Ethan returned the gesture, unable to hide the emotion in his eyes. Naomi continued quietly. "I promised her she would never feel abandoned again. I also promised that her story would never become something people used to admire me. That is why I never explained where I spent my Saturdays. That is why I accepted every misunderstanding." Ethan looked at Grace, then back at Naomi. Every unanswered question that had haunted him during the past weeks suddenly fit together with painful clarity. There had never been another man. There had never been hidden wealth or secret betrayal. The only secret Naomi had protected was the dignity of a little girl who deserved privacy more than she deserved recognition. The greatest act of love in Naomi's life had been one she refused to use to defend herself. Ethan lowered his head. "I spent years believing silence meant guilt," he said quietly. "I never imagined it could also mean integrity." Naomi smiled with quiet compassion. "Sometimes the kindest promises cannot be explained without breaking them." The elderly woman approached and gently placed a folder into Naomi's hands. Naomi opened it and removed a single document before handing it to Ethan. It was the official paperwork confirming that Grace had recently been placed with a permanent adoptive family after years of uncertainty. Every legal requirement had finally been completed. Naomi looked toward Grace with unmistakable relief. "Now that she is safe, her story no longer depends on my silence." Ethan carefully returned the document, feeling as though every success he had ever achieved weighed less than the simple promise Naomi had kept for so many years. Over the following weeks, he quietly began changing his own life. Without press conferences or public announcements, he expanded the educational foundation Naomi had supported, funded scholarships in her name only after receiving her permission, and personally volunteered at the learning center whenever his schedule allowed. At first, the children simply knew him as the tall man who struggled to read funny voices during story time. Eventually, they learned to laugh with him instead of feeling intimidated by him. Daniel Brooks watched the transformation with quiet amazement. The executives who once feared Ethan's constant certainty noticed that he now asked more questions before making decisions. Employees discovered that he listened longer than he spoke. Even the security guards at the Romano building smiled when they saw him carrying boxes of donated books instead of rushing through the lobby without noticing anyone around him. One evening, several months later, Ethan and Naomi stood outside the learning center watching Grace race across the playground with her new family. Autumn leaves drifted gently through the cool air, covering the sidewalks with shades of gold and crimson. Ethan looked toward Naomi. "I do not expect yesterday to disappear," he said. "But I hope every tomorrow proves that I finally learned what you were trying to teach me." Naomi nodded, her eyes reflecting the warm light of the setting sun. "Real changes, never measured by apologies," she answered. "It is measured by what people choose to become after the truth finds them." They stood together in comfortable silence as children's laughter echoed through the neighborhood. There was no dramatic celebration, no perfect ending that erased every mistake. There was only understanding, humility, and a future built upon truths that had finally been spoken at the right time. Ethan once believed that power came from always having the answers. Naomi quietly showed him that wisdom begins with the courage to ask one more question before judging another human being. And on that peaceful autumn evening, as Grace laughed beneath the glowing trees and ordinary life carried on around them, the world remembered what dignity truly looks like.